Welcome to the Holm Edit Up Your Impact podcast series. This is the 4th edition, and today I am super excited to be welcoming Iggy Bassi, who's a co-founder of Earthena AI. Him and Karen Chobra have been building something really different in the enterprise space, an AI-powered decision intelligence capability, and it's designed to help organizations make better, faster decisions in complex environments. This is not another software platform or dashboard. Earthena acts more like an intelligence engine, and it pulls together all the fragmented data, learning over time, and turning it into real-time actionable insights. It's all about helping organizations navigate uncertainty, respond to volatility, and ultimately operate with a lot more clarity. Iggy's work has sat at the intersection of AI, complex systems, and real-world decision-making. He spent much of his career focused on a pretty fundamental question: how do you take messy, uncertain, fragmented data and actually turn it into something useful? Iggy, welcome. I'm so pleased that you are here today. It has been a long time since we've known each other, and it's really good to invite you to the audience.
Well, first of all, thank you very much, Courtney, for the invitation, and wonderful to chat and wonderful to share some of the work that we've been looking at over the last couple of years. The market has certainly changed since we first knew each other. I think we knew each other from what we can now call the climate tech era, and I think that was like 6 or 7 years ago. I think the markets have moved on substantially, and as you know, we've been working on something called Earthena AI, which kicked off in 2023, and we went dark for a while, mainly because we were trying to figure out how to build a new class of models which could move away from what I say is lots of individual silos into something which is a bit more, how do we help large companies make decisions? How do I help Courtney make a decision, not just tell her what's right, what's wrong? Climate Tech 1.0 was very much concerned with measurement and reporting. I'm going to come in, collect some data, I'm going to tell you what's going on, mainly through looking at backward data. But I think where the impairment came for many large companies is, well, that's great. First of all, I've got lots of new models, lots of new data sets. How do I actually make a decision? We focus heavily on supply chain. So, for instance, how do you look at supplier 1 versus supplier 2? I think lots of tools to date are very good at collecting that data in a retrospective way. But actually, the world has moved on, and also we have a lot more complexity now to handle. So whether you're looking at physical, energy, geopolitics, which is very topical right now, regulation, but also I think there's a wider shift. I think supply chains have moved away from essentially 40, 50 years of optimizing for efficiency towards now thinking about resilience. And that's where the clash is coming. So how do we provision new intelligence for large enterprises into their core supply chain decisions around what's going on around their supply chain? What should they do? How should they act? When should they act? What's the KPI impact? What's the ROI impact? But also, we don't just give that as a dashboard. We say, actually, one of the biggest failures in sort of Climate Tech 1.0, lots of this data didn't feed into the decision architecture. Ultimately, it has to surface at the point of decision making. It cannot be retrospective. It cannot be guesswork. Where you're making that decision, we need to surface. And we use a lot of interesting AI to help us get there as well. So that's broadly, in a long nutshell, what I've been up to.
Fascinating. I think the prevalence of relying on historical data to help making future scenario-based models is problematic on so many levels. Can you tell me a little bit about why you think intelligence is so important right now?
I think just the breadth and the depth of sort of data has shifted massively. Also, I think we're getting time compression. Things are happening at rapid speeds all of a sudden. And also, if you're a large supply chain player, you probably have and probably are exposed to dozens of different geographies. How do you think about those geographies all the time in real time, whether that's looking at CO2 policy, water fluctuations, what's happening with social policy, for instance, in various countries? All this will impact your supply chains. It'll certainly impact your margins. And what does that mean for your long-term resilience as well? So whether they're policy related or climate and nature related, or they're just new competitive dynamic. And also there's just new opportunities. Should I switch over to renewable energy in my supplier base in Vietnam versus India, for instance? How do you factor all that intelligence into making choices? We work with some of the largest companies on the planet who are now using the software to think through their decisions on not just immediate supply, mid-range decisions. Where should I think about my supply for new SKUs in the next couple of years, from all the way from seasons the next couple of years, all the way to long term? What's going to happen in the next 5-10 years to certain geographies? How will that impact my suppliers, and how viable will those suppliers be over time?
Can you give us a couple of really practical examples?
There's a large FMCG company who was looking at their options for supply chains in Asia. So I think they have a footprint in about a dozen Asian countries. And they were looking at various suppliers for one SKU level. Prior to us coming in and showing them analysis, they were just optimizing for cost. And we said, actually, if you factor in things like what's happening to the grid and the stability of the grid, the energy mix, and the water that you need, and this particular facility had fairly high consumption of water for their industrial processing. Once you factor those in, again, it's not provisioning data. What our engine essentially does, it allows you to reason across all these dimensions. And what they realize is where they thought they were going to get the biggest cost advantage, also had the lowest resilience longer term. And when we say longer term, we mean in the next couple of years. So suddenly that forced them to rethink their strategy, and they diversified their sourcing strategy because of that. But that's just the kind of example where traditionally they would have been looking across spreadsheets and dashboards and different models and different data sets and talking to different experts and consultants. All this can now be brought at the point of decision making. So now they can type in, give me a profile of supplier 1 versus supplier 2, help me reason and trade off between supplier 1 and supplier 2. Factor in these class of models, factor in policy, factor in water, factor in nature movements, factor in physical hazards, factor in quality, all that combined at their fingertips today. And that becomes quite powerful.
AI is critical to that reasoning capability. Could you tell me a little bit about the Quant Earth engine and how it delivers that reasoning capability?
At the heart of what we tried to do over the last couple of years is to say there's not a single class of models that will prevail over others. If you're a CFO or a CPO or a CRO, you have to reason across all these different dimensions. So first of all, how do we build a class of empirical models which are based on science, they're peer-reviewed, all the stuff that you know that we've done for many, many years. But on top of that, how do we bring together supplier data? So when we're talking to customers, we often fold in their data. Where are your suppliers? How much do you spend with those suppliers? What are you planning to spend on those suppliers? And what QuantEarth really does, not only builds a model, it reasons across all these models. So we have a 4-layer model structure. One, we bring in a lot of outside-in intelligence. A big class of our models is being able to look at the world, being able to look at different suppliers, and form a picture of a supplier very quickly, on demand, everything from physical hazards to carbon footprints to emission profiles for the country in which the supplier operates in, the grid stability, policy issues. All those can factor in very quickly. Then we combine that with the client data to say, okay, how much does Courtney spend with this particular supplier, for instance, right? What's the quality? What's the historic spend? What's the future spend pattern? And then we can reason across all those models to say, how do I optimize for this supplier? Should I spend more with this supplier? Should I spend less? Is this supplier more viable than other suppliers across my chain? What's going to happen to the country? But we've also built in some natural language layers. So you can ask these questions rather than wading through the different sort of analytical features. And I think like so many conversations, Courtney, over time, enterprise software will just become conversational. So we made sure on day one that we are training our AI to be able to look at the empirical models, extract out the reasoning layer, look at the client data, extract that out in a way that's logical, that's linked to KPIs, that's linked to language that people understand in their day-to-day. But then we embed that into workflows or agents or sort of MCP layers, whatever it may be. However, it becomes accessible in the chain of making decisions, not as a once-a-year analysis on supply chains, which often what happens now, or there's a quarterly business review. But QuantEarth continues to grow. As you know, we have billions and billions of different data points. We've looked at companies across supply chains. We looked at mortgage books. We looked at CPG players. We looked at manufacturers, for instance. So we generalized it in such a way that 80% of the answer is going to be common across different clients, different supply chains. And then obviously for the last 20%, we work with partners fairly closely. And also we work with direct customers customers as well to understand the idiosyncrasies of their sector, their KPIs, and also what's their burning issue. Every geography will tell a different story. We're just able to read it better, so to help you make those smarter decisions.
What's your vision for helping turning those smarter decisions, not only in building resilience and adaptation against climate change and geopolitical risks and all the other things that we talked about, into a competitive advantage?
The competitive equation is shifting towards least cost to most resilient. So if you look at all the movements that we've had over the last couple of years in rare earth minerals, reshoring, abandoning some of the climate objectives, all this is feeding back to we're living in a constrained world. We'll continue to be constrained. And those constraints can come from policy, which are man-made. It's going to come from nature as well and climate. How do you factor that in? How do you understand that early? How do you understand that with scenario basis that can help you inform better decisions? There is no such thing as a perfect decision. As you know, you've worked many years as a consultant yourself. So the question is, how do you optimize your decisions? How do you think about trade-offs? And what trade-offs do you want over time? And what are you optimizing for? Are you optimizing for growth, short-term profitability, long-term growth? And markets will reward you accordingly, because markets will also get smart on these constraints over time.
What I often find, the procurement team don't know the right questions to ask in order to build resilience. How does it help ask better?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. And that's actually one thing that we struggled with a couple of years ago. We were surfacing all this reasoning, but then we're latching on to people who are not used to that type of reasoning. So again, it's breaking it down and saying, okay, Courtney, your supplier is in trouble for these reasons. These are the actions you can take. These are the implications. These are the costs. So you almost have to draw out the map in terms of helping you make that decision and understand the trade-offs of various decisions. So those scenarios actually become very powerful because it allows you to see the panoramic of all your variables and say, what decision do you make? We can make a recommendation if you ask for a recommendation, but ultimately those tend to be wrapped up in sort of business objectives, KPIs, quarterly numbers, annual numbers, or sort of strategies that are just not well known. So in many ways, you have to guide them towards how do you think about resilience. But actually, one of the best layers that we put into the platform is quantification, because it doesn't matter what happens, you need to be able to quantify what's going to happen to a KPI, what's the ROI impact, or what's the asset impairment over time. So linking it back to financial value always matters. It's not to say that you can pull out a KPI for every single dimension. There are some dimensions which are just hard. If there's a high prevalence of social labor infringements in a certain geography, in a certain supply chain, can you put a KPI next to it, or do you have to put a reputational KPI next to that, for instance? So not everything is sort of comes down to numbers per se, although arguably you could put a number next to that as well, Courtney. You've sort of seen that happen before.
I think there are a lot of social numbers from an impact perspective in supply chains. There are decisions that can help mitigate some of those risks, but at the end of the day, you need on-the-ground programs to support that. I imagine that Earthena AI can also help with identifying opportunities for program-level activities on the ground.
No, 100%. And that's the benefit of sort of having this deep intelligence library, which is the core part of QuantEarth, because we've already pre-computed and we maintain models on what's happening across different dimensions of risk, but also opportunity. What's happening to things like climate technologies, heating technologies, cooling technologies, renewable energy. What's the grid? What's the stability of the grid? What's the availability of RECs in certain markets, for instance, if you want to look at carbon management solutions? In many ways, having a massive library which is pre-computed, some of which are our own empirical models, but on top of all those models, we process what we call engineered signals, and those signals are what then informs the basis of when that ties together with your data is how do you reason across all these dimensions? How do you weight them, and how do you want to weight them? How should you weight them? What's your KPI objective? So suddenly reasoning becomes very powerful. It's like, imagine you have 1,000 of the world's best analysts, from climate scientists to McKinsey consultants to geopolitics experts, and you have one task for them: build me an engine that can look at any single supplier or a collection of my suppliers across my SKUs anywhere in the world and tell me what's already happened, what will happen, why will it happen, when will it happen, and what should I do about it? That's essentially what QuantEarth is looking to do. Now, you should be able to make better decisions. I think most of the people that use a platform right now are saying, actually, I didn't even realize there was this portrait of these suppliers that I could look at in this dimension. And that's quite interesting for us. That goes to the heart of why you need to tie multidimensional and multi-domain models together in ways that are now suddenly accessible because of AI, because of the way we've engineered it. It makes reasoning a lot more interesting and also cheaper. Courtney, you would have to spend millions of dollars to get some of these answers. You can have them on demand now.
I've been reflecting quite a lot because of the nature of volatility that we're seeing that's different now fundamentally in the past year. And I don't know that it's ever going to not be volatile in the future now. I think we're going to have continuous disruptions for one reason or another. And what I was reflecting on is, in my past work experience and also with some current clients, there's this notion where, especially in operational roles like procurement operations or wider supply chains, logistics, even sustainability teams, they have these KPIs. And the KPIs are set in stone for a year and the world moves on. And those KPIs then no longer become material to the business. Do you think that we'll see an evolution of KPIs?
You'll see an evolution of KPIs. You'll also see an evolution of how decisions get made. I think right now we see AI augmenting decisions more and more. So AI is training alongside the humans. They're augmenting human decision-making across all these variables. And I think they trust the data, they engage with the data, they refine the data where it's bad, or they say, actually add this dimension. I think over time, the nature of risks have become fundamentally different. And I think you're right, they are continually disruptive, and we're entering periods for different risk dimensions that actually we won't see stability again. Then you pair all those risks together, and then you look at your decision-making capabilities and the frameworks of how you've historically made decisions and how you should make decisions over time. And what's the role of AI in that framework? So will we see, for instance, more and more decisions becoming autonomous in certain dimensions where there's a high trust factor of AI? Say every time this happens, alert my operational heads in these countries, or every time I'm likely to see an extreme weather event in the next couple of weeks, reroute my trade, send this to my logistics operators, for instance. So I think there's a certain use of AI where it's just going to smooth out some of those uncertainties, some of that volatility curve. I think the longer term volatility or sort of multivariable or compound effects or whatever you want to call it, synchronized events, we don't really know how to handle those yet, to be honest. I don't think there's a super AI. You can build scenarios, of course. What happens if these 5 vectors happen together, or this happens and that happens, or there's an extreme event coupled with a crop failure here and a breadbasket failure here? You can look at all those scenarios. Can we do much about it preemptively? I'm not so sure.
That multiple point of failure model is, especially around agricultural supply chains, I think it's something that we probably need to get a point where we have a comfortable level of understanding how those individual points of failure ladder up and stack on top of one another, and what that means from a volume perspective of supply. For example, what happens if 40% of the global rice production is hit by weather extreme?
Yeah.
What does that mean for global nutrition? I wanted to ask, having looked at your system so many times over the years and a couple evolutions of, your journey to get to this particular platform. And one of the things that we've talked about for a long time, putting social data into the mix, because before it was really focused on climate and geopolitical data. And I said, people matter. And without having some of the social metrics, especially around displacement percentages and labor and rights issues, tell me a little bit about how things have changed with this platform when it comes to social data.
First of all, thank you for being a voice of social, because I think we have been lacking in that area for the last couple of years. In the last 6 or 7 months, we made some strides, along with nature data as well. I think the social dimensions are fundamental, particularly as we do so much work inside of supply chains. We've now factored in lots of ILO data, labor rights standard, wage theft, wage suppression data, for instance, because all this has a reputational effect on how good is that supplier? How can you get a propensity of measuring that from outside in first? Because people do surveys and questionnaires all the time. Are you paid on time and this and that? I think you have to pair that with some propensity models as well. In that area, we know certain things happen. we know child labor gets used here. So if you get caught, these are the impacts on your sort of potential reputational damage. Now, whether that's an impairment to your market cap or consumer boycotts, it can happen in very extreme cases, but they tend to be short-lived. But it's really fundamental to understand the nature of supply chains overlaid with social data. We also measure things like demographic shifts as well. What's happening to the domestic markets? Are they becoming consumer market, middle-class markets? And what does that mean for the viability of exports from that country into your country? Obviously, rare earth minerals will matter, and I think we're seeing a lot of geopolitics enter into supply chains, the likes of which we haven't seen for many years, maybe outside of high security sensitive areas like the 5G network, like the telecoms network, for instance. Now we're seeing it in many other areas, because you have to remember, we can only get to transition and full transition if we have strong access to rare earth minerals. And that's why there's so much strategic competition now also entering into supply chains. And that's going to be very interesting for the next couple of years.
I feel like we're going to see an increased competitive pressure, and also from governments starting to make really competitive moves. This next decade, we will see the power of political, say, relationship building or dismantling really come to the fore.
Well, we can use the old-fashioned word. I think it's called industrial policy. It matters. If we want mass change, and if you want to smooth out some of these kinks and some of these volatility curves, purposeful industrial policy will matter. And by the way, it matters in America too, as much as it matters in Europe. It certainly matters in China. So states have a huge role to play in how we, one, manage these risks, but also how do we get to a transition that makes sense, that's just, that's fair, that's going to maintain competitiveness as well. We don't have that equation today, by the way. I mean, everyone's taking bets. We don't have perfect models.
I wanted to ask, I've been working in technology for many years as part of the IT organization. And one of the things that I've learned is that, yes, you can have a standalone PaaS or SaaS solution, but unless it's integrated into, your critical architecture, how is it that the tools can be embedded into the established processes and also the IT architecture and to support a different way of working?
First of all, there's lots of the change that's afoot now. And I think AI is rewriting lots of that, what is already established IT infrastructure, SaaS models. I think all this is going through a rapid state of change. I think the growth of MCPs, for instance, LLMs, the way we access information, the way that different specialized data sets have to be paired together, all that is changing. And it's changing because of AI. AI will just make it faster, better, cheap, should make it cheaper and better as well. We don't know. We're still waiting for results, Courtney, as you know. But I think just the transformations that AI is having on the enterprise software landscape is huge.
If I were in my old role and looking at ensuring Earthena AI, what I would say would be, okay, well, how does this sit on top of SAP?
Yeah, and those are live conversations. We say, well, how do you just want the API? Do you want it in an agentic workflow, or do you just want access to the MCP server? Access will change massively depending on sort of what they're building as well. But of course, they have a lot to protect because they're sitting on reams and reams of fantastic data sets, as they have been for decades. So of course, they want to protect that position. So it's up to engines like ours to be versatile enough to be able to say, we can extract your data, put it into a safe environment, and we can run it through the models and play it back to you. Now, we've had some clients that didn't want data to leave their premise, so we have to be on-premise with those guys in terms of sort of cloud infrastructure. There are others that wanted a new class of product because they haven't seen these types of products before. They said, well, what does reasoning actually look like across my supply chain? The trend line will be, how do I make this as seamless as possible? And how does AI call different data sets at the lowest possible price and embed it into workflow, not into dashboards, into workflows?
It's always fascinating to talk to you because whenever I do, and we catch up quite regularly, but you always have something new to say, which means to me that you're constantly evolving your thinking. And as you have more clients that are starting to use the platform, I can see how it's shifting based on what your customers are demanding of you, which is amazing to hear that responsiveness. To wrap up, what's the one thing that the audience should be doing right now that they aren't doing?
First of all, accept that uncertainty is here and it's a permanent state. I hear so many fancy consultants saying, well, we know how to solve your uncertainty factors. Well, you don't, because it's here to stay. So you have to develop the muscle for how do you make decisions under uncertainty. And then I would say start building the systems that allows you to turn that uncertainty into advantage. Quite often, Courtney, we hear a lot about climate, risk, sustainability, resilience as a negative issue. It's also a positive issue to the extent that there are new technologies technologies, there are new cost curves that are now available. It's just good old-fashioned business efficiencies, business logic. Get rid of the word climate and everything else, and guess what? You have a cost saving. Uncertainty is here to stay. Start building the systems around it because it's not going away. And then your future competitiveness will be linked to that as well.
I couldn't agree more. Iggy, thank you so much. It's always so much fun speaking to you.
Well, wonderful to spend some time with you, Courtney, and thank you very much for the invite as well. More than happy to talk again whenever you like. Thank you very much.